Maybe you're not tired because you've done too much. Maybe you're tired because you've seen too much. The noise, the pretending, the quiet dishonesty that passes for connection. Last Tuesday, you sat through another team meeting. Your manager announced exciting changes, but you caught the hesitation before the smile, the flicker of doubt in her tone. Your colleague agreed with every word, yet his jaw stayed tense. Everyone performed their roles perfectly, and so did you, calm, composed, saying the right things. But by mid-afternoon, it felt as if something inside you had run a marathon, not from effort, but from perception. Your mind was tracking two realities at once, what was said and what was meant. You heard the silence beneath the words, felt the currents behind the gestures. And that constant awareness that seeing through is its own form of emotional burnout. This isn't the burnout of doing too much. It's the weariness of perceiving too deeply, of living awake in a world that prefers sleep. It's what I call awareness burnout. You read the room without trying. You sense tension before anyone speaks. You understand motives before they're confessed. And you keep smiling, holding it all, trying not to let the weight of awareness show. You're not broken. You're not even burned out. You're simply conscious in a world that rewards blindness. And the more you see, the harder it becomes to belong. That's the quiet exit of perception, not chosen, but inevitable, when staying awake means living apart. 1. The hidden cost of awareness. Understanding burnout psychology. You're not tired of working, you're tired of pretending. It's a quiet paradox. You can spend 12 hours absorbed in a project and end the day alive with energy. Yet 15 minutes of small talk in a break room can leave you wishing to disappear. The work itself doesn't drain you. It's the performance orbiting around it. Take Sarah, a UX designer in Seattle. For years, she believed she had social anxiety. Every networking event left her depleted, convinced something inside her was broken. But one evening, standing in a crowd of smiling professionals, she realized the truth. It wasn't people that made her anxious, it was seeing through them. I'd be talking to someone, she said, and notice they weren't really listening. They were scanning for someone more useful. Their question was a cue for self-promotion. And I'd still nod, still pretend not to notice. That is the hidden labor. No one speaks of the burnout from emotional labor. Every interaction becomes a silent decoding exercise. The colleague who says, "I'm fine with either option," but tightens his jaw when you suggest one. The manager who asks for your opinion, though the decision is already made. The client who praises your work while preparing to undo it. You see it all, the fractures between word and truth, the dissonance between inclusion and control, the choreography of competition behind the facade of teamwork. And the most exhausting part isn't what you see. It's pretending you don't. Because if you name it, if you gently observe what's real, you become the problem. You're too sensitive, reading too much into things, creating tension. So you play along. You dim your awareness. You join the collective performance. Carl Jung once wrote, "To become conscious is a painful act." He wasn't speaking in metaphor. Awareness carries a cost, one that modern burnout psychology often overlooks. When you perceive more, you bear more. Every simple exchange becomes a layered experience, the words, the intent, and the gap between them. Your mind works quietly like background software running diagnostics, scanning tone for hidden discomfort, reading micro-expressions for contradiction, measuring emotional temperature, translating subtext into truth. It's not paranoia, it's perception without rest, the essence of emotional exhaustion. A nervous system doing what it was designed to do, but doing it constantly in a world that never stops performing. Think of your last meeting. How much energy went into the actual topic, and how much went into sensing tension, reading motives, managing fragile egos. You walked out not only with tasks to complete, but with an invisible burden. The unspoken emotions you absorbed, the dishonesty. You had to tolerate the masks you politely acknowledged. That's what empathic burnout feels like when sensitivity becomes a silent workload. And the more you think about it, the more you feel trapped in a cycle of overthinking and exhaustion, trying to stay aware yet craving peace. As one creative director said, "It's like everyone's speaking English, but I can also hear the frequency beneath, and that frequency is screaming." The tragedy is, once you've learned to hear it, you can't unhear it. You can't return to surface conversations or ignore the false note in a laugh. You keep showing up competent, composed, adaptable, while fluent in a language you never wished to learn, the language of pretending not to notice. So ask yourself, how much of your fatigue truly comes from work? And how much comes from the quiet daily effort of suppressing what you perceive just to make others comfortable? Burnout psychology teaches us that burnout isn't always about overdoing. Sometimes it's about overseeing and having no place to rest your awareness. That heaviness you feel at the end of the day isn't weakness. It's the toll of consciousness, the cost of staying awake in a world that rewards sleepwalking. 2. When awareness becomes a trap. The hidden cost of awareness. Burnout. There comes a point when awareness, the very thing that once liberated you, begins to confine you. It happens quietly, without warning. One day you realize you're no longer living. You're observing yourself living. You're not in the moment, you're dissecting it. Marcus, a software architect from Austin, described it perfectly. I'd be having coffee with a friend, and instead of simply being there, I'd watch myself being there. I'd note their gestures, track the subtext, analyze their tone. By the time I got home, I could tell you everything about the conversation except how it felt to be part of it. That is what happens when awareness stops being a tool and becomes your identity, the beginning of awareness burnout. Carl Jung burnout describes this state well, when consciousness expands beyond balance and perception becomes self-consuming. Jung called it consciousness inflation. When a person awakens to deeper perception, but begins to mistake awareness itself for superiority. It's subtle. What began as sensitivity turns into a shield, and the mind clings to being the one who sees. You didn't mean for it to happen. You were simply observant, insightful, attuned to what others missed. People admired that about you. You just get people, they'd say. And slowly, without noticing, that became who you are. Not just something you do, but something you must be. Now, awareness is not your companion, it's your cage. First sign, you analyze everyone all the time. Your sister mentions changing jobs, and before she finishes, your mind is running a full diagnostic. She's deflecting from her relationship issues. This is a control pattern. Or your colleague seems quiet, and instantly your mind builds a story. They're disengaged. Maybe they're job hunting. Sometimes your reading is right, but sometimes she just wants a new job. He's just tired. You've become so accustomed to reading between the lines that you've forgotten people sometimes mean exactly what they say. This is seeing too much psychology, the mental habit of decoding reality even when nothing's hidden. Second sign, you feel isolated because no one understands. You tell yourself others are asleep. You're awake. They live on the surface, you live in depth. But beneath that quiet pride is a fear that connection is possible, and you've become unreachable. Jake, a writer in Brooklyn, once told me, "For 2 years I thought I was too evolved for small talk. Then I realized I wasn't deep. I was lonely. I'd turned my awareness into a wall and called it enlightenment. That loneliness feels noble when it's dressed as consciousness, but often it's just avoidance wearing philosophy's mask, a symptom of over-awareness fatigue, where sensitivity has no rest. Third sign, you're exhausted from performing awareness itself. You're tired of pretending, yet now you're pretending not to pretend. People expect you to be the one who understands, the one who sees clearly. And you deliver because that's who you think you are. But deep down, there's a quiet longing. What if I could just not know for a while? You've built a new persona, the conscious one, and it's just as heavy as the mask you took off. This is the unseen side of sensitivity overload, when emotional depth becomes performance and awareness becomes armor. Here's the truth that stings awareness can become an ego defense. It feels spiritual, but sometimes it's simply a way to stay safe. If you're the one who sees, you don't have to risk being seen. If you're analyzing others, you don't have to face your own uncertainty. If you're watching the game, you don't have to admit you're still playing it, just more subtly. This is the paradox. The awareness that once freed you from illusion becomes your newest illusion. You think you're staying conscious, but really you're staying protected. A therapist once told me, "Those most attached to awareness are often most afraid to feel. Analysis is easier than experience. Understanding is safer than uncertainty." When was the last time you allowed yourself not to know? To sit in confusion without rushing to decode it, to be present without extracting meaning from every moment. The fatigue you carry isn't from being too conscious, it's awareness. Burnout. Not the pain of ignorance, but the exhaustion of knowing too much, seeing too clearly. Sometimes true awareness isn't about seeing more. It's about daring to stop seeing long enough to be. 3. The lonely gift of seeing too much. Understanding the psychology behind emotional burnout. There is a special kind of loneliness that comes with clarity. Not the loneliness of being alone, but of being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen, as if a glass wall separates you from the world. Elena, a brand strategist in San Francisco, described it to me once I went to a dinner party. 8 people, good wine, smart conversation, art, politics, travel. Everyone was laughing, connecting. But I felt nothing. Not anger, not boredom, just distance. Like I was watching a play I'd already seen. I could predict every line before it was spoken. I went home and cried, not because it was bad, but because I couldn't find my way back inside it. That's what happens when you begin to see too clearly. You don't withdraw from the world quietly withdraws from you. This is seeing too much psychology when heightened perception starts to separate you from the collective dream. Carl Jung called this the withdrawal of projection. It's the moment the collective illusion dissolves and life stops mirroring back the meanings that once made you feel at home. Most people live inside that dream. They project significance onto neutral things. Work feels important, titles feel real, weekends feel free. These aren't truths, they're shared agreements. And those agreements hold society together until you begin to see through them. When awareness deepens, the veil thins. You start noticing how much of human life runs on projection. You watch colleagues fight over job titles and see it for what it is, an argument about labels. You hear people speak passionately about corporate purpose, and you sense the emptiness beneath the enthusiasm. You're not judging them. You're simply outside the spell they're still under. Conversations start to sound familiar, rehearsed, predictable. At a networking event, someone asks what you do, but they're already waiting for their turn to speak. At family dinner, your uncle debates politics with certainty. Your cousin outlines her 5-year plan. Your mother asks when you'll settle down, as if life follows a script everyone quietly agreed upon. You nod, contribute, play your part. But inside you feel like you're translating a language you once spoke but no longer believe in. That's the exile effect. Not because you've rejected others, but because you can no longer fully inhabit the illusions that keep belonging easy. David, a creative director from Chicago, said it best. I used to think I was broken, that I'd lost the ability to enjoy things. But then I realized I'm not broken. The lens just changed. Once you've seen the projector, you can't pretend the movie is real. And that's the heart of this strange loneliness. It isn't that people are fake. It's that they still believe sincerely, wholeheartedly in the stories that no longer convince you. They find meaning in structures you now see as constructs. They live within shared illusions. You live beyond them. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You see how few things you need to be happy." He wasn't glorifying simplicity. He was describing this quiet distance, the clarity that strips away illusions until only the essential remains. And that clarity can feel like loss. You lose the comfort of shared narratives. You lose the ease of fitting in. You lose the borrowed certainty of chasing what everyone else values. But you also lose the tyranny of it. When projections fall away, so does their power over you. The opinions that once wounded you no longer reach as deep. The achievements that once defined you lose their shine. And the fears that kept you performing, they begin to loosen their hold. You are lonelier, yes, but you are also free in a way most people never taste. The world no longer reflects back a safe image of who you should be, it simply is. And in that stillness, something rare appears: space. Space to choose what truly matters. Space to connect without performing. Space to live deliberately, not reflexively. One woman, a designer who walked this same path, told me, "For a long time I felt like I didn't fit anywhere. Then I realized I was waiting for permission to belong. But belonging isn't given, it's chosen. It starts when you make peace with your own story, even if it doesn't match anyone else's." That is the paradox of awareness. The more awake you are, the lonelier it feels at first. But it's not a curse. It's the beginning of individuation, the process Jung described as becoming who you truly are rather than who the collective expects you to be. It hurts because it's a birth, and every birth involves leaving something behind. You are not broken for feeling detached. You are not cold for craving depth. You are not defective for seeing through what others take for granted. You are simply awake, learning how to live with what you see. And while that awakeness may feel like exile, it is in truth a return not to the world as it was, but to yourself as you are. This is the healing side of emotional burnout, when psychological fatigue turns into insight, when empathic burnout becomes discernment, and when sensitivity overload finally transforms into inner peace. Because once you've learned to see too much, the journey is no longer about seeing more, it's about seeing wisely. Your mind won't stop thinking the psychology of emotional exhaustion. Your exhaustion isn't a flaw of the mind, it's a signal of emotional exhaustion, the quiet cost of vigilance. Every time you walk into a meeting, a dinner, or even a simple conversation, your brain does far more than listen. It runs a full diagnostic scan beneath awareness. Voice tone. Is that pause honest or strategic? Micro-expressions. Did the smile reach their eyes? Energy pattern. What's shifting in the emotional current? Subtext. What's being left unsaid and why? Threat detection. Is this safe? Is this real? Can I trust it? You don't choose to do this. Your nervous system does. It's the ancient machinery of survival wired to read danger in human behavior, but now operating non-stop in a world that never stops performing. Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people found something revealing brains wired for deep processing. Literally burn more glucose. You're not weak, you're metabolically overextended. Most people process one stream of information. You process 4 tone, context, history, and implication all at once. And the body pays for it. Constant interpretation activates the same biological systems designed for physical threat. Your body doesn't distinguish between decoding a passive-aggressive email and escaping a predator. Both release cortisol. Both keep you alert. Both deplete your reserves, a core insight of burnout psychology. Rachel, a journalist from Boston, once told me I'd have days with barely any real work, a few emails, a short meeting, and feel completely drained. My therapist said, "You're not weak. You're exhausted from vigilance." That landed hard. My body had been on high alert all day, and that's as demanding as running a marathon. It's not your intellect that's wearing you out. It's empathy without boundaries. You feel what others feel even when they don't show it. You absorb tension like air. Someone walks into the room anxious, and soon that anxiety is living in your chest. A partner's frustration becomes yours. Even a stranger's sadness at the grocery store pulls you into silent empathy. That's not compassion. That's porous empathy awareness without containment. Feeling everything doesn't mean you understand everything. It simply means your emotional borders are open and every signal finds its way in. By evening, your body carries 12 different emotional imprints. Tight shoulders, clenched jaw, shallow breath. You lie in bed, but your mind keeps scanning. Did I say the wrong thing? Why did she pause before answering? What was he really feeling when he went quiet? This is overthinking and exhaustion, the endless narration of perception. The problem isn't thinking, it's the inability to stop naming everything you see. Here's what changes everything. You don't need to shut your mind down. You only need to stop naming what you see. Rest doesn't mean blindness. You can't unsee. You can't unfeel. Rest means allowing perception to pass through you without commentary, without possession. With commentary. That person seems uncomfortable. I wonder why. Maybe it's me. Maybe I should say something. Without commentary. That person seems uncomfortable. Full stop. No follow-up. You're still aware, but you're no longer working on the awareness. You witness, but you don't weave a story around it. You let the experience exist and then let it leave. This is the discipline no one teaches the perceptive to witness without absorbing to notice, without processing to understand, without intervening. Your sensitivity isn't a burden. Your intelligence isn't the problem. The real strain comes from believing that awareness demands action, that if you see, you must solve. But you don't. Sometimes seeing is enough. Sometimes noticing is complete. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is let the truth move through you without owning it. Your mind may never stop thinking, but it can learn a gentler way of thinking, one that doesn't tighten its grip around every detail, one that processes without drowning, one that sees without carrying. That's not silencing your gift. It's refining it, learning to hold your awareness like still, water clear, calm, and free. And when you do, you'll begin to heal from mental exhaustion, causes that have nothing to do with overwork and everything to do with over-awareness fatigue. 5. Learning to see without hurting. Healing from awareness burnout. There's a quiet line between awareness and wisdom, and most people never cross it. Awareness is the act of seeing. Wisdom is knowing when to look away. For years, I believed consciousness meant vigilance, to miss nothing, to perceive everything, to read every silence and decode every gesture. I mistook clarity for control. But one evening, a teacher changed how I understood this entirely. His name was Thomas, a philosophy professor in his 60s, gentle in tone, steady in presence. We met at a Stoicism conference, sitting in a dim hotel bar after a long panel. I was still dissecting the event, the speaker's posture, the audience's reactions, the unspoken dynamics in the room. Thomas watched me quietly before saying, "You're exhausting yourself trying to hold the entire ocean in your hands." I looked at him confused. He smiled. "You think wisdom is about seeing everything. It's not. It's about knowing what deserves your attention and what doesn't." The Stoics called it the view from above. You see the whole picture, but you're no longer drowning in it. That conversation stayed with me, because the view from above isn't detachment, it's perspective. It's the art of seeing clearly without falling in. Imagine you're in a plane looking down at a traffic jam. You can observe the frustration, the chaos, but you're not in it. You're not honking. You're not trapped. You see it for what it is, and then you see something else. That's mature awareness, the kind that notices without clutching. You still recognize the passive aggression in your colleague, the tension at the family table, the mismatch between words and energy. But instead of gripping it, dissecting it, owning it, you let it pass like a cloud drifting across the sky. This is how healing begins from awareness burnout, when perception no longer feels like pressure. Here's a practice that transformed the way I move through the world. When you see falseness, don't correct it. Let it pass through you like a cloud. Someone takes credit for your work. The old you spirals, analyzing motives, replaying every moment, crafting responses. The wiser you notices, names it quietly, and lets it move through. Not out of indifference, but understanding not everything you perceive requires your emotional participation. Falseness exists whether you grip it or not. Dysfunction continues whether you analyze it or not. The question is whether you carry it afterward. Maya, a product manager in Portland, described her shift this way. My mother-in-law made another subtle jab about my parenting. Normally, I'd spend hours dissecting it. This time, I just thought, she did it again, and looked out the window. I didn't need to fix it or even understand it. It was just something that happened, and then it was gone. That's the quiet maturity of consciousness, the moment you stop mistaking seeing for possessing. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wasn't asking us to deny reality. He was teaching discernment, the essence of burnout psychology. See clearly, but don't let what you see live rent-free in your soul. When I feel myself gripping what I've observed, I imagine my hands unclenching. I picture holding the tension, the dishonesty, the human mess, and then gently opening my palm. I see you. I acknowledge you. But I'm not keeping you. This isn't detachment through denial. It's clarity through surrender. It's the understanding that perception is a tool, not a prison. You can observe dysfunction without becoming its caretaker. You can notice pain without becoming its vessel. You can see clearly without letting everything you see take root in you. This is where sensitivity overload begins to soften, when your nervous system no longer confuses awareness with obligation. Here's how it looks in real life. Your friend lies. The old you analyzes, confronts, spirals. The wiser you feels the small sadness of recognition, then asks, is this mine to carry? Usually it isn't. Your workplace is chaotic. The old you documents, strategizes, loses sleep. The wiser you sees it clearly makes informed decisions, but doesn't try to save what refuses to be saved. Awareness shows the truth. Wisdom decides what to do with it. This balance is what Carl Jung burnout speaks to, the fatigue that comes not from ignorance, but from insight held too tightly. This is conscious not withdrawal, but return. You haven't abandoned the world. You've returned to the inner ground that can hold awareness without collapsing under it. You are in the world, but not consumed by it. You engage, but you no longer lose yourself in the noise. An exile in truth is not someone cast out, but someone who discovered that home was never out there to begin with. It's here in the stillness that can see without suffering. James, a therapist I once spoke with, captured it perfectly. I used to come home from sessions completely drained, carrying every client's pain. My supervisor asked me, "Do you think your suffering helps them?" It didn't. My job was to see clearly and hold space, not to drown. That question saved his life and healed his empathic burnout. The practice isn't to see less, it's to grip less. Not everything you notice asks for action. Not everything you understand demands intervention. Some truths simply ask to be witnessed and then released. Like watching a river flow, you see the current, the debris, the reflections. But you don't try to organize the water. You let the river run as it will, knowing its nature is not yours to manage. Your awareness was never the burden. The burden was believing that awareness meant responsibility. Wisdom is realizing you can witness the whole world and still belong to yourself. You can see people's pain without making it your emergency. You can sense falseness without letting it poison your peace. You can live awake and still be at rest. That's not exile from the world. That's the return home to the quiet center that can see everything without being wounded by what it sees. 6. How to rest your awareness. Healing from emotional burnout and exhaustion. You don't need to become less perceptive. You only need to learn how to set your perception down gently, intentionally, without fear of losing it. Awareness, like any muscle, can only serve you when it knows how to rest. Here are 3 quiet practices. Small, deliberate acts of release that help you reclaim stillness without losing depth, especially when facing emotional burnout and emotional exhaustion. 1. The one honest moment rule. Once a day, choose one ordinary moment to exist without commentary. Not a meditation session, not a ritual, just one breath of undivided presence. It could be your first sip of coffee in the morning, the short walk from your car to your front door, the silence before answering a phone call, or the water running down your shoulders in the shower. In that brief space, your only task is to experience, not interpret, not optimize, not extract meaning. When the analysis arises, and it will, you simply notice, there's the commentary. Then softly redirect. Not now, just this. Why it works. Your awareness has been overtrained in vigilance. This moment teaches your nervous system that stillness is not danger, that the world will not collapse if you stop scanning it for 60 seconds. Start small. 60 seconds is enough. Nina, a researcher from Seattle, told me I began with my morning coffee. Just the warmth, the aroma, the taste, no plans, no thoughts. For 2 minutes, I wasn't performing consciousness. I was simply living it. This simple act restores balance to a mind trapped in burnout from emotional labor, where empathy, overthinking, and care have quietly turned into fatigue. 2. The mute observation exercise. When someone speaks, listen to their voice as sound, not meaning. For 10 or 20 seconds, let their words become music. Notice the rhythm, the pauses, the pitch, the texture of the human voice, fragile, melodic, imperfect. Don't decode the emotion behind it. Don't prepare your response. Don't read subtext. Just listen the way you'd listen to rain or a cello in another room. Why it works, it interrupts the compulsion to translate life into data. You remain deeply present, but your mind stops laboring. It's perception without possession, awareness without strain. A designer once told me about trying this in a heated meeting. Instead of tracking everyone's agendas, I listened to the sound of the room. The tempo of interruptions, the shifting tones. I was fully there, but not entangled. And when I finally spoke, my words were clearer because they came from quiet. This practice helps dissolve psychological fatigue, the invisible weariness that builds when perception never turns off. 3. The Psychological Distance Journal. Keep a small notebook, digital or paper, for one question to carry. Whenever you feel weighed down by something you've noticed, tension, sadness, unspoken, emotion, pause and write. Whose emotion is this, mine, theirs, or collective? What would change if I released it from my awareness? Am I holding it because it's necessary or because it's habitual? You're not forcing detachment. You're cultivating discernment, separating empathy from absorption. Sometimes the answer will be yes. This one is yours to carry. A friend truly needs your support. A project genuinely needs your care. But more often than not, the answer is no. That tension in the meeting, not yours. That person's disappointment, not yours. That dysfunction, not yours to fix. That gap between words and truth, not yours to bridge. Why it works: it transforms perception from a sponge into a curator. You stop absorbing everything indiscriminately. You begin to choose what deserves space in your inner world, and what leads to mental exhaustion, causes that drain your peace. As you practice these small acts of release, you'll notice something subtle but profound. The world doesn't need you to see everything to stay intact. Your relationships don't depend on constant analysis. Your worth isn't measured by how deeply you perceive. And when you rest your awareness, it doesn't fade, it refines. When you stop processing what isn't yours, clarity returns. When you stop gripping every signal, your perception becomes sharper, not duller. These practices aren't about escaping awareness, they're about maturing it. You're not closing your eyes to life. You're learning how to see without strain. Because wisdom, as the Stoics knew, isn't the act of seeing everything. It's the quiet mastery of knowing what truly deserves your sight and having the strength to look away from everything else. Otro, finding stillness after awareness. Burnout. You were never meant to close your eyes just to survive. You were meant to see and still remain gentle while seeing. The exhaustion you've been feeling isn't proof that something is wrong with you. It's a message, a quiet signal from a mind that's been working without pause, carrying more than it was ever meant to hold. Your awareness has been running constantly, decoding, understanding, sensing, and now it's asking for something simple. Permission to be still, not blind, not numb, just still. This is not weakness, it's recovery from awareness, burnout, and emotional exhaustion, the kind that builds slowly in those who care too deeply and think too much. There is no shame in being someone who notices too deeply, who feels the undercurrent, who sees what others miss. These aren't flaws disguised as virtues. They are legitimate gifts that simply need clearer boundaries. You are not broken because the world tires you. You are awake in a culture that rewards sleepwalking, and the tension is heavy to bear. But the answer isn't to close your eyes and join the crowd. The answer is learning to rest, while conscious to observe, without absorbing, to see clearly, and still hold yourself with tenderness. That is how you heal over-awareness fatigue, not by turning away from the world, but by softening your grip on it. Here's your quiet invitation for the week. Choose one evening to practice the art of not decoding. Don't analyze, don't interpret, don't read between the lines. Have a conversation without commentary. Watch a show without critique. Sit beside someone without trying to understand them. And before you go to sleep, write one simple line in your journal. What changed when I stopped decoding the world? Maybe nothing changes. Maybe everything does. But in that stillness, you'll have given yourself something rare, a moment of perception unburdened by performance, free from psychological fatigue. If this message resonates, share what you notice when you try it. Or simply keep it with you for the next time the weight of awareness feels too heavy, and you need to remember that your sensitivity was never the problem. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not doing it wrong. You are simply learning how to hold your gift without letting it crush you. And that learning, that quiet integration of strength and softness, is the real cure for Carl Jung burnout, when depth meets discipline, when awareness learns to rest. Because wisdom isn't the end of seeing. It's the beginning of seeing clearly, calmly, and without pain.